Protean views, as they are called, are essentially miniature dioramas for use at home. The diorama itself was invented by the French scenic designer Louis-Jacques Mondé Daguerre, together with a French painter called Charles-Marie Bouton in 1822 in Paris. Daguerre is more famous now for having been the inventor of the daguerreotype some years later, which is an early type of photography. The diorama was essentially an enormous painting, painted on both sides of the canvas, and they were shown in specially designed buildings that allowed the proprietors to light the picture from both behind and above using natural light. It was a specially constructed building that allowed them to do that in such a way that the picture appeared to change its aspect. So the scene would change, for instance, from day to night. The early ones generally were concerned with atmospheric changes. So you might have stars appearing in the sky or mist forming and then disappearing. One show would include two views, a landscape scene and an interior, for instance, the interior of a cathedral, as is the case with this lithograph here. The diorama was essentially a large flat painting, albeit painted on both sides. But spectators who went to see it found it really difficult to believe that that's all it was. It seemed so incredibly real and three-dimensional. They just couldn't believe it was just a flat picture. Now, part of that effect would have come from the fact that at the diorama, you were seated in a darkened auditorium, which would have been quite novel at the time because theatre auditoria were, of course, still brightly lit at that time. Being seated in a darkened auditorium would have increased the illusionism of the show because it meant that the image would have appeared like a sort of hallucination. Daguerre and Bouton brought their invention to London in 1823. Within 5 years of that, British scenic designers opened a rival institution which they called the British Diorama on Oxford Street, which was similar, but it used gaslight rather than natural light. Apparently the illusion in the British Diorama was not quite as effective as Daguerre's version. But it did have the advantage that because they used gaslight and they weren't reliant on natural light and the vagaries of the weather. But this here is a miniature version based on the same principle and made by a British firm. It's part of a series called Spooner's Protean Views. So it dates from the late 1830s. It's a lithograph that's printed on both sides in the same way that the diorama was painted on both sides of the canvas. So the idea was that you could use this at home and use your own lamp or light from your window to create the dioramic effect in the comfort of your own home. So I really like the way with this one you have the effect of coloured light coming in from this stained glass window to the left and casting coloured light on the stonework. This is exactly the sort of effect that people like Daguerre had developed in the theatre using gaslight, which could be projected from a hidden source on stage. And gaslight, of course, was another new technology at the time. So if I use this table lamp to maybe create the dioramic effect. If I light it from the back, it turns into a nighttime scene of midnight mass. The light coming in through the window to the left is now moonlight, and the altar is lit with candles, so you have candlelight as well, and the church is now full. The interest in striking light effects is something we see in both 19th century painting and theatre, especially effects of coloured light, which become associated with particular emotional states. So if you were doing this at home, you could use a coloured lampshade or window blind to create your own effects with different coloured light. So I'm just going to see what happens if I interpose just a green acetate to kind of create weird, ghostly sort of green light. And what happens with that? Or I could try a blue one. So at home you could use, whatever coloured curtains you had or lampshades and just kind of manipulate it and make your own effects. But in the 1820s, when the diorama first appeared, it was marketed as a perfected painting. And there was a moment when maybe people thought that this is what painting was going to be like from now on. In the same way that the invention of perspective in the Renaissance changed the way that paintings were made, it was seen by some as a new technology that improved the illusionism of art by introducing movement and the passage of time and making it seem more real. So there was a point when it was thought that, this is the new painting. This is what we're going to have from now on. On the other hand, there's a sense at the time that this type of image uses trickery to fool the eye. And there were critics at the time who felt that, that's not really what serious painting ought to be. So in a way, these are quite different from the large-scale diorama paintings because you're not sat in a darkened auditorium. You yourself are in control of the lighting effects. But since we have hardly any surviving large-scale dioramas, these do tell us something about how fascinated people were by certain effects of light, atmosphere, and transformation. In fact, you could even make your own transparencies, as these are sometimes called, and there were books that you could buy that instructed you how to do that for yourself.